So I recently watched a TEDx talk on the topic of conscious parenting by Dr. Shefali Tsabary, and I was blown away. In fact, the presentation moved me so much that I continued my investigation about her work, and I started to realize that she's been involved with world leaders like the Dalai Lama and Oprah, for example. And she actually recently published this book called The Awakened Family: How to Raise Empowered, Resilient, and Conscious Children. And this book really resonated with me because it, in my opinion, puts the spotlight exactly where it belongs, which is, of course, on the parents. You know, growing up, my dad would always say, "Sean, nobody is responsible for you but you." And, you know, he told me this throughout my whole life. And that advice really stuck with me. And now, remembering that advice always helps me to parent myself as well as my own two children. So what I wanted to do in this episode was simply discuss the main theme, at least what I got out of the book, the main theme of the book, as well as 7 big takeaways that I got out of it. Now, I actually got about 15 to 20 takeaways, but we don't have time for that today. So I really consolidated this the best of my ability and made sure that I gave you 7 of the biggest takeaways that I found from the book. So the main theme that resonated with me the most was this theme of, you know, in order to raise these resilient and empowered and conscious children, we as parents need to become conscious as well. So that's a very difficult, difficult concept as a whole for me to grasp. But you know, due to Dr. Shafali suggests that due to our own unconscious upbringing, so whether that's through our own parents or our own culture or society as a whole, we have great difficulty raising conscious children. And it's on us to kind of peel back the onion and turn inward and discover, you know, what it is from our own childhood that's making us behave or be triggered in the ways that we're triggered with our children. So some pretty deep stuff here. So for example, when our kids don't listen to us, we might react in a way that's rushed or angry or misaligned from what we know is our highest self, right? And you know, again, in order for us to figure out why we act this way, we need to kind of go back to our own old childhood and you know, kind of figure it out in a sense. So very, very, very interesting. And rather than reacting the way that we do, if we could understand our own behaviors better, we could then in turn help our own children with theirs and ultimately connect with them on that deeper, more intimate level that really all children, you know, so deeply desire, right? So let me get to some of the main takeaways here. First big takeaway is this idea of mirrors. Oh my gosh, you know, this one I'm still learning a little bit about, but Dr. Shafali suggests that children are here to act as a mirror into what we don't know about ourselves or what we don't understand about ourselves. Very, very powerful stuff. And, you know, we become triggered because of our own unresolved pain that ultimately stems from our childhood, you know? And in order for us to break the cycle, you know, we must turn inward and look within ourselves and figure out what exactly is going on so that, most importantly, I believe, we don't enable that same behavior in our own children as they mature and live their life, right? So very, very powerful concept of mirrors. Again, I'm still trying to, you know, let it resonate and trying to figure out what I need to do and when those times are in my life, in my day-to-day where, you know, my son or my daughter is kind of holding up the mirror because I've had a reaction to them that I'm not too proud of, right? So second big takeaway here is this concept of time zones. So Dr. Shafali suggests that the clash of the time zones is what's primarily responsible for the disconnect we have with our own children. As adults, you know, oftentimes we dwell on the past or we're overly focused on the future, right? And rarely do we really spend a lot of time enjoying the present moment. So of course, children on the other hand are completely engaged and fully immersed with whatever they're doing in the present moment. And oftentimes we're rushing them and transitioning them very quickly to that next activity. And of course, they're hesitant, right? They don't listen to us the way we want them to, or they're hesitant because they're thinking, hey, wait a minute, I'm totally content doing whatever it is I'm doing right here. So in order for us as parents to improve upon that, we need to be a lot more mindful about implementing those transition times, those buffer times in our own day-to-day that's going to allow us to kind of wind down the current activity with our children and ultimately transition better, more calmly into that next activity, whatever it may be. Powerful stuff. The third big takeaway is what Dr. Shefali says is the antidote. So in order to correct, so to speak, a child's behavior, or in order to rebalance them in a way, I hate to say correct, but if a child is out of balance, in order to balance them back to center, so to speak, we need to really embody the antidote to their behavior. So what in the world does that mean? Well, just as nature balances itself, we too must balance our own children, right? So if they're being very resistant to us, we can perhaps come with an antidotal energy of playfulness and calm. If they're very anxious, we can dial down their level of anxiety by dialing down our own, right? And if they're very aggressive or angry, we can certainly help balance out that behavior by reducing our own amounts of aggression or anger. Fourth big takeaway here is this idea of natural consequences. Ooh, I like this one a lot. We as parents have this tendency to punish our children. And of course, there are all these books out there about these coercion techniques and whatnot, and all these courses that help you coerce your children into doing certain things. But this idea of natural consequences helps us understand that perhaps punishments are actually creating larger rifts between us and our kids. And Dr. Shefali is suggesting that natural consequences, on the other hand, address the actual need that the child is experiencing through their behavior. So she gives an example where, let's say your child forgets something at school. So we look at what that need is. And maybe the need is improving their organizational skills, long-term memory, or maybe their lack of ability to focus on something more intently. So rather than punishing them, that natural consequence would be, not rescuing them in any way, not driving them back to school or calling the teacher or anything like that, but just letting them suffer the consequences the next day of being forgetful. And of course, you have to use your discretion there. If it's life or death, obviously, you're going to come to the rescue as their parent. But if it's something that the child can afford to go through, I think it's an awesome concept, this idea of natural consequences. I absolutely love that. And what a great experience for the child, of course, because now they really understand the cause and effect of their actions, whatever it may be. Fifth big takeaway, boundaries. Another great one here. So as parents, we need to be radically clear about the boundaries we set for our children. And boundaries, as Dr. Shafali suggests, should be tied to a child's well-being, right? And a child's safety, instead of just some ad hoc boundary that we as parents create out of thin air based on whatever the present moment is, whether we're tired or anxious or whatever else. So once we clearly identify a boundary, we then need to decide whether or not a boundary is negotiable or non-negotiable. And if a boundary is non-negotiable, we need to then enforce it with what she says are the 3 C's: clarity, calmness, and compassion. And I'll add a fourth one to the mix, which is consistency. It's on us as parents to really toe the line and hold the vision for those non-negotiable boundaries in a absolutely consistent way so that no confusion is caused with our children, right? The 6th big takeaway is this idea of creating room. And this was very, very helpful to me. I haven't really thought about it in this sense before, but rather than jumping in as parents with our habitual reactions to our children's behavior, we need to quiet down and simply observe them. And if we're willing to do this, it creates room. So Dr. Shefali talks about room for curiosity. Rather than try to control them, if we're in a calm state, we might get kind of curious as to why they're behaving the way that they behave. And this will ultimately lead to us understanding them better and being more empathetic towards them. She talks about room for sharing. Again, if we're in a calm state, we might think back to the time when we were children as well and decide, you know what, I was going through something similar, and maybe I could share through my own story how I connected with whatever it is they're going through and the lessons that I learned since I'm on the other side of that. So room for sharing. I find with my own children's story, whether it's with my 4-year-old son or my 2-year-old daughter, story is a very powerful way of connecting with them on that deeper level and kind of just almost snapping them out of a funk. Very, very fascinating how well story works. Dr. Shefali also talks about room for humor. So again, when we're in that calm state, we might actually find whatever situation that we're in with our children to be kind of comical and somewhat hysterical. And maybe through introducing some humor into the situation, we can connect with them and actually help them to learn the lessons that we're looking for them to learn, right? And finally, room for creative practice. When we're calm, we might find an opportunity to role play or do a role reversal session with them, in which we're really just going into this mode of creative practice to really help them, embody whatever it is, that lesson we're wishing to teach them. I've also found that creative practice, whether it's role play or role reversal, has been very powerful in helping my children to just, again, really embody the lessons that, my wife and I are looking to teach them. Seventh and final big takeaway today, and this one hurts. It's personal. It's hypocrisy. So if we take the time to actually reevaluate some of the areas in our own life, we may find that we've been very hypocritical with some of our own behaviors. So, for example, how often are we telling our children to, turn off their screens, get off the iPad, get off their phone? But if we take a step back and evaluate our own life, how often are we guilty of doing this? How often are we, our heads are buried in our own phone or on our laptops, right on the table? How often are we guilty of that? We tell our children to be active and exercise more, but how often are we actually getting out of the house and exercising ourselves? We yell and scream at our children. We actually scream at our children. I catch myself doing this. I'm yelling at my children to stop yelling. So, how often are we as parents yelling and screaming at them, but we're sitting here telling them not to do that same thing, right? How often are we telling them not to be so forgetful and forget their things while here we are, over here forgetting our own keys or forgetting, whatever it might be. We run an errand and we forget the grocery list. So how often are we forgetting our own things? So it's this concept of hypocrisy that really woke me up and almost forced me to kind of reevaluate some of my own behaviors that ultimately they're going to embody. I mean, they're with me and they're with my wife, more time than anybody else that's with them, including their teachers. So how often are we being hypocritical as far as what we're telling our children versus, how we behave on a day-to-day basis? Very important. So there you have it. There's the main theme that I got out of the book. There are the 7 big takeaways. Again, the book is called The Awakened Family: How to Raise Empowered, Resilient, and Conscious Children by Dr. Shefali Tsabary. I'd highly recommend this read. I've actually been through it 3 times, and I anticipate going through it a 4th or a 5th time. And every time I do, I learn something new. A lot of these concepts are new to me, and some are very difficult to grasp, but I've found it just absolutely invaluable for me as I further my journey into becoming, a better parent, not only for myself, but also for my children. I'll leave you with one of my favorite quotes in the book, and it's when Dr. Shafali talks about her goal as a parent. And here's what she says: "My goal as a parent is to raise a child who is firmly rooted in who she is, certain of her inherent worth, able to express herself with authenticity, and be grounded in her relationship with me." I absolutely love that. Hope you found this episode helpful. I can't wait to see you and serve you next week. Take care.